Yes, I wrote this book really because I was rather shocked, in fact, by the optimistic statements which were being made about India's future, being talked about a great superpower, being talked about the luckiest country in the world because of its young population. The idea, I was afraid, which was being put across was that India was on sort of like one of those walkways you have in an airport, and all you had to do was stand on it and it would calmly take you to the status of being a great power. And I thought this was very dangerous because I believe firmly that India can become one of the world's largest economies, a major player in all senses in the world. But I do believe that there are problems which must be overcome. And if you are over-optimistic, you ignore those problems, you don't do anything about them. So that's really the reason why I wrote this book. Yes, I covered stories mainly which were where I felt that which showed up the administration and the administrative problems in this country. For instance, I did a story on the Naxalites in Jharkhand, and one of the things I was very keen to do there was to talk to the police and put the police's point of view across simply, not that I wanted to be biased or anything, but I wanted people to understand the limitations under which the police operated, so that people would begin to think hopefully about the police in this country and the need for reform in them. And in the police story, for instance, there's one police officer who says the whole problem with the anti-Naxalite campaign is that people are not realizing that really this should be an intelligence-based campaign, and it's not an intelligence-based campaign because the police's intelligence systems are so weak. So that is just one example of what I wanted to do. With the currency at the moment of the whole question of FDI, foreign direct investment, I wanted to see how contract farming was doing in Punjab. So I wrote a story which was in part about PepsiCo and the potato contract farming which they do in Punjab, in which I discovered that there were major snags which could arise with contract farming, and that if things went smoothly, farmers liked it and it was valuable. But there were many farmers who had withdrawn from contract farming because they found that they had to buy the seeds from PepsiCo, they had to have all the inputs from PepsiCo, all the inputs PepsiCo wanted them to have, and then they took their potatoes to the factory gate and they were told, we don't want your potatoes. So they were then landed with all these potatoes which they had to sell in the market, and the heavy overheads of buying special seeds and special fertilizers. So for some farmers it had been a success, for others it had not been a success. And I felt that this was an appropriate warning to those people who think that FDI in retail, contract farming, supply chains, modern supply chains, are necessarily going to be the answer to all India's agricultural problems. The whole essence of this book is not to say anything in black and white, not to say that there isn't an advantage in contract farming, to point out the advantages, but also to point out the disadvantages, so that people can take the discussion further than the sort of, I'm afraid to say, I would say trivial level that it's discussed among politicians. Well, basically, obviously, in part, to be honest, I chose them because I was interested in them. I avoided one subject which I would love to have included, and I think is an important subject, and is an example of how the administrative system in this country is not working, which is the railways, which I think could be a huge asset to this country. And I'm a great believer in railways, and I think it's a great tragedy. But I thought if I wrote about railways, I would become a railway bore, so I avoided doing that. But basically, there were subjects I was interested in. For instance, I love going into the jungles, and I love wildlife, I love tigers. And I thought that also the tiger story you could use as a sort of parable, because the tiger is always said to be the peak of the environmental pyramid, and that if the tiger is healthy, then a whole lot of other things, from the tiger's food, the food of the tiger's food, the food the deers eat, and all the way down, the environmental or ecological situation is healthy. And here again, I wanted to bring out the inadequacies of the Forest Service. And one of my particular points is how so many of these services have really unreformed since the British Raj. So with the Forest Service, you have what is in effect a crude police force, which is charged now with trying to win the cooperation of the locals. But its whole ethos, its whole training, its whole attitude is to treat the public as enemies who might trespass in the forest. So that was one of the reasons why I did that. One other thing I'd say in this context, I did want to show, you know, the amazing changes which had come in this country. And that's why I wrote a chapter on Tatars. And it wasn't meant to be a critical chapter. I wasn't looking for the faults in Tatars. I wasn't looking for the fact that, for instance, many of the companies do not show a return of 10% on their capital. Because what I wanted to show was the release of entrepreneurial energy which had taken place with the end of what I always call the Neta Babu, or the license permit Raj, and how Tatars which had been held back by the license permit Raj, the enormous expansion which had taken place since then. No Full Stops was a book about something which I feel really quite passionate about, and still do. It was really a book about how I still think India should cast off the final shackles of colonialism, should stop looking over its shoulder at the West and developed countries all the time, and try and find answers to its problems which are based on Indian cultural traditions and the specific needs of India. And so when I was once sitting before a camera like this, and Karan Thapa, you know, the great interrogator, said to me, "It seems to me that you want to drag India back to some golden age which never really existed." And I said to him, "I don't want to drive India back. I want India to go forward." And then I asked him in Hindi, I said to him, "Do you want, though, an Asli Bharat or a Nakli America?" And that was what No Full Stops was all about. And there was, therefore, in a way, more passion in that. This is a much more, you might say, laid-back book. You might say less personal book. But what I felt about this book, and as I said in the introduction, is I really wanted the voices of Indians, like the voices of those policemen, the voices of villagers surrounding the forests, the voices of the executives of Tata. I wanted them to speak rather than me being the speaker. You know, there are an awful lot of books written about India by foreigners, which turn into the foreigners pontificating, shoving their own views down the reader's throat. And in this book, I particularly didn't want to do that. I particularly wanted this to be the voice of Indians. So some people have said, why didn't I say more about the answers? Well, it wasn't really a book about answers. It was a book to try and persuade people to ask questions, because that seemed to be the important bit of it, because people were not asking questions. People were saying, we're going to become a great power. You've got a television particularly which sort of copies the West, basically, and frankly copies it rather badly as well, and does not concentrate on telling Indians about what is really happening in this country. And one of the great problems of this media is that it does not examine things in any depth. And there is one tahelka, one tamasha, one sensation one day, and the next day they're all running around looking for the next sensation. A week later, you've completely forgotten what Monday's sensation was because there's no depth in it at all. And I believe that that where you've got a country where you've got so many talented documentary makers, for instance, you've got so many talented filmmakers, so many talented writers, so many people with huge talent in front of the camera and behind the camera. It's a crying shame that you don't have documentaries on television telling people the sort of stories that I tell in this book. There should be a room for it. But everyone in television tells me, oh, the TRP, is that the right word? The audience figures don't show that people want it. But my argument is that you're not giving them a chance, A, and B, what you cannot do is surely be totally bound by audience figures. And I would argue that what India really needs is that Doordarshan and All India Radio become much more like the BBC. Now you'd say, I would say that. And there we are, perhaps talking about copying the West, and I say we shouldn't. But some form of independent public service broadcasting. Corporatized, or if you like to call it like that, but independent of the wretched I&B ministry and independent of commercial pressures too. And then what happens then is that the public get a taste for documentaries and things like that, and the commercial channels realize that they've got to go that direction themselves. So one of the things that I would hope one day is that someone will translate my books into Hindi, but in other Indian languages. And I have to say that one of the stories I've written in this book is a point which I'm passionate about, and that is the damage which English does to Indian languages, the damage which English has done to my Hindi as well. The difficulty of learning Hindi in a country where so many people want me to speak to them in English all the time. So I do wish that more of the writing in Indian vernacular, I don't like the word vernacular, Indian languages is translated into English, and more English is translated into those languages, because I think there is a great opportunity there for sharing among writers as well of the different languages.